Hello friends, welcome to another Word of Gord. Tonight it's another in our ongoing series of average folks in the afterlife. I've read from many spiritualist and channeled texts and automatic writing over the past few months, and I'm continuing on with a book I think that should be better known as it's accurate, relatively modern, post-war anyway. And for those of you younger folks, that means World War II, not any of the 57 wars that have happened since then. But since so many of the spiritualist texts are older than that, it is valuable. And it does portray a certain level of modern consciousness. And it is something of a classic, I think. The information is generally accurate as far as I'm concerned, and still useful in this 21st century to those of you who are experimenting with going out of body, lucid dreaming, or trying to recollect your experiences out there at night and put them together into some kind of convincing narrative that fits to your 24-hour life cycle. Because we do go in and out of consciousness. We are astral, we are mental, we are physical. We move in and out of all the levels. And our day-to-day physical lives have a tendency to limit our consciousness of that. And that is covered in this book. A Soul's Journey by Peter Richelieu. Generally available. There are several paperback editions that you can track down. I have an earlier hardback edition from 1972, Turnstone Press. It was also published in South Africa in the 1950s under the title From the Turret. You can track copies of that down for a couple of $100. It takes the form of a memoir, a narrative and a memoir of a British airman stationed in Ceylon who is contacted by a guru type teacher and shown how to not only go out of body and explore while asleep, but to recall it and write about it. And in my experience of esoteric teachings and guides, that's usually the reason they do that, so that the experiencer can share. It's not just for the experiencer, it's for as many people as can be reached. So, it takes place during World War II. There's a lot of war memories, Blitz type memories. The man is stationed in Ceylon, it seems to be, but is taken to London and at the time of the Blitz, which makes it quite vivid, and then to upper areas of the astral where the war and the Blitz doesn't matter at all. So it's a very good book, and I'll be reading several sections over several episodes here. Certainly won't get it all covered in one. It's much too interesting and too long. And I will be sort of improvising editing as I go along, as there is a lot of interesting material here. I think you will all be interested in this, those of you who have been following along. So it should be noted that the student who is learning and being taught is also, amongst other things, given a pill, which is not how shall we say, explained pharmaceutically. We never know what kind of a pill it is, but it is mentioned that he is given a pill that enables him to more readily be conscious out of body and recall it later in detail. So a small note for us pill-popping 21st century types. I would say that earlier spiritualist texts would not have mentioned this sort of thing, even if it was done. But there you go. Life changes and things move on. As I say, I'll edit as I'm going along. When I became aware of existing apart from my body, my heart seemed to palpitate, but I cannot say I was exactly frightened, and I certainly did not have any desire to rush back. To say I was surprised is putting it mildly. I was excited, I was thrilled. There was a semblance of fear also, a fear of the unknown, a fear of the unusual. To my astonishment, it was light as day. This was my first realization of the light which rules everywhere and all the time at the astral level. And although I hardly noticed its character at the time, I found later that it is a blue-grey light. If you can imagine what a room looks like just after dawn is breaking, only much lighter, it will give you some idea of the appearance of my room. I heard a merry laugh behind me, which oddly enough did not startle me at all. I turned around and there was Charles, looking exactly the same as when I'd seen him last. His deceased brother. Obviously he was enjoying my surprise and my incredulous expression, and his face was wreathed in smiles with all the jolly old wrinkles that I knew so well showing as in the days that were gone. Automatically I clasped him by the hand, and at once felt his hand clasp as firm and as real as it used to be. My Indian friend, who I had not noticed before but who was also in the room, said, "Yes, he is real all right, as I told you, and because you are using at the moment the same type of body as he is using, he is naturally as real to you as you are to him." My joy at seeing Charles was so great that I suppose I spent quite a minute or two shaking him by the hand, putting my hands on his shoulders and altogether satisfying myself that he was really there, in the flesh. I found it difficult to appreciate that although the astral body looks like the physical so far as features are concerned, yet it is not in any way physical and has no flesh, bones, or tissues. However, Charles was real enough for me, and I started asking him 1,001 questions, such as one does with a person one loves and whom one has not seen for some time. I wanted to know how he was, what he was doing, was he happy, and when he could get a word in edgewise, he quietly said, "Don't you worry, I'm all right and having a good time, as you will see for yourself." I commented on his still wearing his uniform. "Oh, am I?" he replied, and went on to say that he had not thought about what he was wearing. My Indian friend then explained that I saw Charles dressed in his uniform because that was what he was wearing the last time I had seen him, and so I, unknowingly, had made a thought form of him dressed in his uniform, and the plastic astral matter had immediately responded to my thoughts. He told me also that even if Charles had thought about what he was wearing before seeing me, I should not have seen him dressed in the type of clothing he had imagined unless he had mentioned it to me. I would always see him dressed as I imagined him to be. So those of you remembering your lucid dreams, take note of that. You are often seeing the deceased as you expect them to be. Not always, but often. My Indian friend then asked me what I would like to do. Charles suggested that we start with an astral dinner and asked if I'd like to go to the Trocadero Grill, which was a favourite haunt of ours when we were in England together. Naturally, I said yes, wondering how it would be managed. But having seen Charles alive, very much alive, I felt that nothing was impossible. "Come along then, let's go," said Charles, and began to leave the room. I went to open the door and Charles immediately started pulling my leg about it. He explained that I would have to get accustomed to going through doors on the astral plane without bothering to open them. And although it seemed strange, I found that this was so, for the door offered no obstacle to my passage. As my bedroom is on the first floor, I started going down the stairs in the usual way. I noticed that Charles, who was ahead of me, did not use the steps at all, but just floated down, a foot or so above them, and I found I could do the same. This floating was certainly a strange sensation at first, but the absence of the force of gravity, to which we were so accustomed at the physical level, soon proved a great advantage, and one which one gets used to it very quickly. We set out at what seemed a pretty fast pace. I kept close to Charles and my Indian friend, who was on the other side of me. I asked Charles how he knew the way to England, to which he replied that you soon get used to finding your way about. We passed over a harbour, travelling about 10 yards above the sea. I looked around and saw the lights of Colombo, Ceylon, fading in the distance. Then for a few seconds we did not seem to be passing anything at all. It was difficult to distinguish the actual places that we passed, for almost as soon as they came into view on the horizon, we had passed them. Apart from this fact, the sense of amazing speed was hardly noticeable, for there was no headwind, such as one notices at high speeds in the physical world. There did not seem to be any resistance at all, and I found later that there is none, for the astral matter is so fine in texture that passing through it at what must be a terrific speed, compared to what we are used to here, makes no difference at all. In about the same time that it has taken me to describe this journey, we came to land, which Charles informed me was Old England. He told me that we had taken more or less a straight course, for naturally it was unnecessary to make any deviations, as land or sea make no difference to travel under astral conditions. When we reached England, which I recognized when we slowed down over Dover, I became fascinated with the ease with which we moved. It is difficult to describe in ordinary language, but if you can imagine what it would be like if you were to travel at any speed you wished, merely by expressing a thought to that effect, that should give you some idea of the process. We had gone up higher as we approached the land, and now we floated some yards above the tallest houses in London. We came down to street level when we were over Hyde Park. I knew it was still daylight, for no lights were showing, although we had left Ceylon shortly after 10 p.m., which was 5:30 p.m. in England. But the light of the astral world is just the same here in the East, when it was nighttime. I commented on this and was told that the astral body never requires rest, so there is neither night nor day at the astral level. This is one of the first interesting points of difference between the two worlds which made an impression on me. Charles suggested that I might go along Oxford and Regent Street to see how it felt to walk in my body. To be walking along Oxford Street, where I had not been since 1939, just as the outbreak of war, was indeed intriguing. The street was thronged with people, and as one would expect to be at that time of day. Although the pavements were crowded, this did not seem to make any difference to us because we actually walked through the people in their physical bodies who were traveling in the opposite direction to us. It is not strictly correct to say that we were unaware of walking through them, for we felt as if we were passing through a small cloud of mist when we did so. For a moment we were enveloped in it, then we were through it, and then everything around us was clear. The mist did not in any way impede our progress, but we did feel it, and in a similar way we came in contact with other people using their astral bodies. And when we did, we felt them to a slight extent, although they did not in any way hinder us. In the world, I have often seen a person shudder and in a joking way say that someone was walking over his grave. I now know that this sensation must have been caused by a physical body coming into contact with an astral entity, which, although the astral matter is too fine in texture to interfere with the physical body passing through it, it does leave a slight impression. I thought that my Indian friend must look rather unusual in these surroundings in his Eastern clothes, so mentioned this to him. He replied, "I do not suppose you know that I have changed my clothes. If you will look at me now, you will see that I am dressed in a similar way to Europeans we see around us." I did look, and it was so. His turban was no longer there, as his skin was almost white as ours. He looked very much like one of the Indian students who are often seen in London. Because he mentioned it, I saw him as he had imagined himself. He explained that one soon gets used to changing one's clothes, as circumstances make such changes desirable. And the plastic astral body immediately obeys the thought, even as it is made. I said I would like to stroll into Selfridge's, which we were passing at that moment. No one objected, so I went in and made my way to the bookstall. What kind of a fellow was he? I've always been attracted by books, and picking at one of the new ones, I turned over its pages. As I did so, I noticed that there was no gap in the shelf from which I took it, and on inquiring why this was so, I was told what I was holding in my hand was a thought form of a book that I was interested in, the physical one on the shelf not having been moved at all. Point. Remember that. As you're wandering around at night as a ghost and you go to physical places, you will actually perceive and touch the thought forms of physical objects, not actually the physical objects themselves. If in fact you don't whip your hand right through it, which is another story. It was an amazing sensation. I wandered round the huge empty shop, for naturally at that time of evening it was closed to the public, and I heard quite plainly the clocks in the nearby department chiming the hour of 6 o'clock. What a lot had happened in the half an hour that had elapsed since I got out of my physical body 6,000 miles away. My companions seemed highly amused at the interest I was showing in things, but Charles obviously enjoyed the unique position of guide, exactly as we all enjoy showing a friend round a new country, as we so often do in the quote-unquote mysterious East, where we meet most of the big incoming liners bringing friends from home on their first visit. I believe that's a reference to him staying in the East after the war. Although all this book concerns experiences during the war period. Charles said he wanted to show me some of the damage that had been done to London through the raids. He took me to various places such as St. Paul's, where it was very obvious what Londoners had suffered through these dreadful bombings. It was necessary to travel among the main buildings of the city to see the damage properly, but in our astral bodies that proved no difficulty at all. As we were walking along a street, Charles said, "Come on," and immediately floated over the heads of the stream of traffic. I found it quite easy to follow, as immediately I expressed in thought a wish to do the same, and I found myself side by side with Charles floating gracefully and easily over the crowded metropolis of London. He suggested that we have a look at our old home in Warwickshire, which I had not seen for many years, and what seemed like a few seconds only, he had steered me to the right spot. I asked how he knew his way about so easily, having only lived under astral plane conditions for such a relatively short time. He told me that he had made many friends on the other side, who had been only too glad to put him wise to the different conditions, and besides, that his training as an RAF pilot had taught him quite a lot about going places as the crow flies. Seeing the River Avon winding through lovely Warwickshire countryside was pleasant, and we soon came down to earth near the spot where our former home stood. And yes, that's always a high spot for me doing astral travel, is following the path of a river. It's quite, it's all magical, but that's some even more magical. How well I knew the old place, even though since I'd seen it last, many small houses had sprung up in the immediate neighbourhood. The house looked much the same, even the two lawns in front and behind seemed much as they had been when Charles and I played in them as youngsters. I wondered who lived there now, for after my father died it had been sold because my mother was not left sufficient money to keep up the place, and I, the elder son, had settled in the east. I walked inside, for by this time I was beginning to realize that a closed door made no difference, and saw strange people occupying the rooms we had loved in the old days. I suppose it was very foolish, but they seemed to me to be intruders, and with different furniture around, the atmosphere of the house had quite changed. We did not stay very long, but soon returned to London. Now you'll see the reflection of the former tenants as ghosts visiting the house and feeling uncomfortable. Well, the stories you hear of ghosts hanging around the house and angrily trying to change things and knock things over because they don't like the renovations, well, that's an extension of the same experience he was having, although he didn't have the attachment. So essentially the ghosts just have an attachment to how things used to be, a sense of ownership and pride that they will not give up. And sometimes for decades, as we know from the various ghost stories that we've read, if not centuries. It was certainly very thrilling to stand in the centre of Piccadilly Circus where the flower girls used to be in the days of peace, but without the figure of Eros, which had been removed to avoid damage. The crowds were still there and the buses and taxis continued on their normal rounds, the only difference being men and women in uniform. In fact, there seemed to be more people in uniform than in civilian homes, which brought home to me that England was not only a country at war, but a country where every able-bodied man and woman was expected to take his or her part. And we'll not get into too much nationalism here. You know, every other country in Europe was much the same at the time. And going about astrally in any other city in Europe would be very, very similar. Small point. It was nearly 7 o'clock when Charles suggested that we have dinner at the Trocadero Grill. We walked into the foyer where we found that most of the small tables round the wall were already occupied. My Indian friend said that he would then leave me in Charles's care whilst we had dinner, as he had other work to do, and would join us later. Assuring me that Charles was well able to introduce me to this type of amusement on the astral plane with a cordial, "Have a good dinner," he left us. And guides often do that. They take you to somebody that you need to see or you're comfortable with or is on your level, and you hang out with them for a while, and then the guide comes back later. And guides have always got 4 or 5 things to do, and it's not that hard. You can whip around all over the place and talk to different people. I've done it myself many times. And not just me, lots of people do it. Charles explained one of the very important points which must be understood when having an astral meal or drinks in a restaurant, which existed in reality at the physical level, as compared with doing the same in a restaurant that had been created by ourselves through the medium of imagination or thought. He said that it was always unwise to sit down at a table which actually existed at the physical level, for, as we were invisible, people who came and saw the vacant table but who did not see us would naturally take possession of it, which would be slightly inconvenient. When they sat down, they would not feel our presence, but the same sort of thing would occur to us when we passed through crowds on the streets. When a physical person sat on the chair that was occupied by you in your astral body, you naturally expected to feel something, and although there was no resultant unpleasant feeling, it was not entirely pleasant. It could be avoided, he said, by producing in thought a table for one's own party in a space where, physically, no table stood. And he did so right away, in the foyer, and asked me to sit down. He told me that by thought also he would produce a waiter who would appear to us exactly the same as the other waiters we saw moving about their normal business, but that this waiter would not be seen by the physical occupants of the foyer. He did this, and at once I saw a waiter approaching our table who asked us what we would drink, in just the same way that we would have expected had we been there as ordinary members of the physical world. Charles ordered a dry sherry, and I a whiskey and soda. For Charles told me that having been prohibited alcohol for the 2 days prior to this experiment did not apply here. That was something his teacher had said to him, no booze for a couple of days before, and I guess the pill. It's not explained. I was supplied with my drink and Charles with his, and the taste to me was exactly what I had expected it to be. I was told that, had I never tasted whiskey in the world, I would not have been able to appreciate the taste of it at the astral level, though I should undoubtedly have tasted in the astral liquid what I presumed to be the taste of whiskey. Whew, that's a relief. I do like my whiskey. Charles told me that one day when my Indian friend was instructing him in these things, he asked him to have a drink. He ordered a glass of water, telling Charles that it would be useless for him to order whiskey, sherry, or vodka, as he'd never tasted them in his present physical life. So not being able to imagine the taste of these drinks, all pleasure would be lost. Same thing applies to smoking. We sipped our drinks and watched the people. We could even hear the buzz of conversation around us, and this bore out the point which has been made, that every physical sound has its astral counterpart, and, as it were, sounds a note which can be heard by those using the astral body. Looking at the various types of people who were constantly coming and going, I should not have realized that at that moment England was fighting with her back to the wall. They all seemed to be enjoying life, with plenty of laughter intermingled with chatter. Charles called out to a young man dressed in an Air Force uniform who had just arrived, and they greeted each other with much enthusiasm. Charles brought him over to our table and introduced him as Roy Chapman, a pilot who had been killed in the Battle of Britain the previous autumn. He was a good type, and when I asked him how he liked living under astral plane conditions, his reply was enlightening. "It's all right," he said, "but boring after a while. At first, of course, it's rather nice being able to get everything you want without paying for it, but the novelty wears off, and frankly, I would far rather still be with the old squadron." I thought it was a unique opportunity for finding out things, so I asked him what he did with his time. He replied that he did more or less what the spirit moved him to do, and went on to say that, at the moment, he was waiting for a girl he knew to meet him for dinner. I asked him if the girl was dead or alive. He said, "Oh, dead, of course, if you still want to use that old-fashioned expression." It's useless making dates with people still living in the world, as just when you're in the middle of something interesting, they have to go back to their bodies. Point. In a few minutes that were left before his girlfriend arrived, I gathered from him that he had tried all the usual games and found them pretty boring. To play golf, for example, and he had been a low handicap man before he was killed, was pretty futile, when all you had to do was imagine that you had a birdie or an eagle for the thing to be an established fact. There was no such thing as competition, as you only had to make a thought form of beating your opponent for it to happen. The same applied to billiards. There was no fun in making a big break when you could always do it at will. The element of chance was lacking, which took away the charm from all games of skill. I saw that and realized that my Indian friend was indeed right when he said that life on the astral could be boring for those whose interests were entirely dependent on physical plane conditions. I asked Roy whether he had been fond of music or art during his lifetime, to which he replied that he had not. He had done a spot of dancing and liked music now and then, but could not say that it had ever given him much serious thought. I suppose that when he eventually got tired of meeting friends and living on the fringe of the physical plane, life would find something else to interest him. Or life would in time become boring in the extreme. This is touched on many texts, and it can be extended. There are games on on the astral plane, different games at different levels, and the lower vibratory levels, it's almost possible to play sports, and you will see that because the vibration is too low. The people that live there are relatively ignorant and don't know either that you can influence the ball or the putter or the tennis racket or whatever with your thought and play the games more or less as they're played here. But as you rise up and either in vibration or understanding, it becomes more and more difficult. And then at other levels, there are ingenious games of like the one portrayed in the Harry Potter film, the one where they're all flying around. And that takes a certain level of, how shall I put it, mental restriction. You have to sort of agree that you won't do all this stuff, or you fight mentally as well as, physically over control of the ball, or the object of desire. Objects of desire. Interesting point on the astral plane. It's the plane of, desire. What one wants and what one is after. We then went down to the grow room, and choosing a spot near the corner where there was no table, Charles made a thought form for one of us. A waiter arrived almost as we sat down and asked what we would eat. Charles told me to order anything I fancied. I must say I was not exactly hungry, but the unique experience made me order a sole à la bonne femme, chicken Maryland to follow, and a pêche melva, and a cup of black coffee. Sounds like a good meal to me. Charles ordered 2 Bristol cream sherries and a bottle of Chambertin 1933, this being the year which he said he knew was good. I asked if these drinks were actually on the wine list in wartime, to which Charles replied he did not know, but in any case it did not matter, for on the astral plane you got whatever you ordered, whether it was procurable at the physical level or not. Point. I enjoyed my dinner, the cooking being, of course, as perfect as I imagined it to be. I could just not get over my sitting seemingly in the Trocadero, having a perfectly normal dinner with old Charles, surrounded by just the types of people I knew would be there on almost any night of the week. So, is that enough for now? Maybe a little more. Just then I caught sight of an old pal who I've not seen for years. The last time we met was on board ship in 35 when I was returning to Ceylon from my home leave in the Himalaya. I strolled over to him, leaving Charles at our table. My friend in a party of 4 was obviously enjoying himself, since he was holding forth in a way that he always did. I tapped him on the shoulder and said, "What on earth are you doing here?" But he took no notice of me at all and continued with the story. He certainly was in good form, because I could hear every word he said, and his companions were in fits of laughter. So I found it quite impossible to make any impression on him, so in disgust I turned back to my table, where I found Charlie highly amused at my discomfort. How the devil could I tell whether he was real or unreal? I asked. Charles replied that he was amused at my use of words real and unreal, for they just do not exist here. He explained that at first it was difficult to tell, but there was a difference. The astral body which we saw was not clearly outlined in the case of the man using his physical body, whereas that of a permanent resident in the astral world, also of a man functioning at the astral level during sleep, had a much clearer outline. There was another difference to be noted, and that was the faint soul concord of etheric matter, which was always attached to those who were temporary visitors, who never seemed to be quite as much alive as the permanent inhabitants. You soon get used to judging, apart from the silken cord, which was not easy to see. He asked me to compare Roy Chapman with the other diners in the grow room. There certainly was a difference, for the outline of Roy's body was more clearly defined than that of the others. The reason for this may be that when the astral body is being used as a permanent vehicle, the ego inhabiting it has no dual existence, as it has when the man is still living at the physical level. Well, that's probably enough for tonight, and we'll certainly be continuing with this in the near future. Much of interest and pleasure in this book. Enlightening and entertaining, as all good books should be. So, Average Folks in the Afterlife continues, just as life here continues. It never stops. It goes on forever and ever and ever. In and out, in and out, in and out, back and forth, back and forth. Different bodies, different egos, different cultures, different lessons to learn, different pleasures to experience, all that stuff. Take care, my friends. Talk soon.